So what makes Bridgerton special? For more than half a decade, Bridgerton has been occupying quite a comfortable space within pop culture. As Joanna Robinson points out in her article for Vanity Fair titled, "How Bridgerton Officially Became Netflix's Biggest Hit Ever," Bridgerton came at the unfortunately opportune time of the pandemic. The show arrived at the end of a very tough year, offering a lush and soapy escape to a touch-starved, isolated audience that, thanks to stay-at-home orders, was watching more TV than ever. So it perhaps made sense that, trapped inside their homes during difficult times, people gravitated towards it in droves. Yet the author of the article provides additional reasoning behind Bridgerton's success, stating that Shondaland, aka the company producing the show, embracing Regency romance has validated legions of largely female readers who used to hide their steamier titles away behind other more acceptable books. Without the stigma, these relatable stories of men and women trying and often failing to find love have hit new nerves. Silke Wunsch of DW, in her article titled "Why Fans Are Obsessed with Bridgerton," postulates that it's the way these fairy tales are combined with a modern zeitgeist that make the series a resounding success. Historical accuracy is less of a priority here, quite the opposite in fact. The show is redefining the period piece genre. She also notes that early 19th century England is portrayed as a luxurious fantasy world, and that is indeed what Bridgerton thinks it is. It sees itself as this larger-than-life fantasy that is this weird blend of modernity and Regency, this sexy, thrilling show that allows you to escape into another fantasy world away from your issues. It certainly thinks itself as incredibly romantic in the way it portrays the world, the characters and the plot, and it maybe even would be, if this fantasy wasn't selective, if it wasn't as shallow, if it wasn't at times this hypocritical, and if it wasn't this unromantic. For better or for worse, Bridgerton has always had a stilted idea of love. I am not necessarily speaking of the different ideals or mores that the Regency era had. I am speaking, however, of the dissonance of what Bridgerton thinks is romantic versus how their supposed romance actually comes off. And here is one example for you, and perhaps the most infamous one from the entire show. The funny thing is that because of this issue, I never really liked season 1. And then while now I can say that there are some qualities to it, when I first watched the first season, I absolutely could not get what was so romantic or hot about it. I watched it way back in 2020 during the pandemic because a friend recommended it to me, and I didn't touch it afterwards. And I remember for the longest time that while the plot details faded, the dislikes still remained. The season did something so weird that the feeling persisted, and quite recently, a month or so ago, I began rewatching it. And I remember texting that friend who recommended it in the first place all those years ago saying, "Oh, it's not actually that bad. I mean, the couple is being kinda toxic, but it's not all lost just yet, right?" That was until episode 6. Episode 6 of the first season depicts a situation where Daphne Bridgerton is guessing whether her husband, Simon Bassett, is being truthful about his claim that he cannot have children. Simon told her that he cannot have children, which leads Daphne to believe it is because he physically can't. He does the funny thing of lying by not elaborating. Because he isn't explicitly lying, he made a vow to his dad that he would never continue his line, and that is the reason that he can't. It is a bit of a complicated situation because Daphne is generally inexperienced in sexual matters, so she doesn't know exactly what Simon means, but she assumes it's biological. She then notices him pulling out, which then leads to her investigate, and then she finds out that having a kid happens by, well, not pulling out. So during the following intercourse, Daphne flips Simon over and forces him to finish inside of her, which is something that he explicitly did not want. This scene has been discussed over and over. It has been called SA, it has been called the R word, some title it reproductive coercion. Whichever you want to consider it, the fact is clear. What Daphne did was wrong. What particularly irks me in this situation is that the show clearly recognizes Simon's part in this, and make no mistake, it is big. He wasn't truthful to his wife about the one thing that was the most important to her, while also knowing full well that she doesn't know better to realize the full scope of the situation. That in itself is an awful thing to do and breaks trust on a very deep level. And Simon does get shit for it, and the show makes him apologetic over it. Yet Daphne, doing what she did, expresses no regret, nor does she ever apologize, because the show apparently doesn't have the faculties to see that there was something wrong done by her in the first place. And that is why I strongly disliked season 1 even to this day. A thing to note is that this scene also existed in the book, The Duke and I, written by Julia Quinn, and it was also controversial, even more so than in the adaptation. But the show did choose to adapt a version of the scene. The adaptation is less severe, I suppose, since book Daphne took advantage of him while he was unable to consent. So good for them, I guess. So here's what Chris Van Dusen, the original showrunner, has to say about this choice.
We are a show that allows our female characters to be complicated and to be far from perfect. They often have to make complicated choices. In the writer's room, we discussed that scene at length. We felt that the female characters on the show, Daphne especially, should be allowed to do just that. She should be flawed. She should be able to make questionable choices. We felt a responsibility to the story of the education of Daphne Bridgerton, and that scene is very much a part of her story.
So a couple of comments as we go. I can agree with wanting to make Daphne complicated, but I don't think that by just saying, oh well, Daphne's just flawed, is raising a productive discussion. There is a difference between being I said the wrong thing to someone type of flawed and I ignored someone's consent type of flawed. But the more ridiculous statement, I think, comes right with the next response by Chris.
I think part of the scene's design was to raise conversation. The conversation that this scene has brought up around consent is an important one to be having. It's one that we encourage audiences to engage in. The show can only present our commentary and we can only present our critique. That's what the show does, and that's what the scene is really about. As storytellers, we can't really pass judgment on the decisions Daphne makes, but it was important to us to understand why she's making those decisions. I think the why of it is all pretty clear.
I like this statement, because we are just a step away from putting something meaningful together. The man almost had it, and it's gonna be a bit of a theme in the future, by the way. So, chat, are we presenting our commentary and critique, or are we not passing judgment on Daphne's actions? Those two things are not entirely compatible, and only one of them can be fully true. Because the show does pass judgment on Daphne's actions, completely foregoing any substantial reaction by Simon to abusing consent is indeed a choice in commentary and critique. There's no such thing as pure objectivity in fiction or critique either way, so let's not pretend that there is. I believe that while they may have had earnest intentions in including this scene to stir discussion is still quite a telling choice. Favoring one side over the other by making only Simon be apologetic is also a choice. And then we get to my favorite argument that the show faces repeatedly. That is the historicity argument. It's what I would like to call Schrodinger's historicity. It applies to basically any historical piece, but not to the extent that it applies towards Bridgerton. It's when Bridgerton uses whichever argument is convenient for them to justify their choices. It is always either,
oh, it's like this because it's historically accurate, or oh, it's like this because we didn't aim to be historically accurate.
Fair warning, I will be the pettiest about this particular part because Bridgerton has no place to use historicity arguments to justify controversial choices. That train left the station a very long time ago. You can observe this exact contradiction in the very same article I have been quoting right before. What was your outlook on negotiating the relationship between historical accuracy and creative liberty?
Well, with our show, we strive to honor the history, but we're not beholden to the history. At the end of the day, the show is for a modern audience. There's a modernity to everything we're doing, from the themes to the characters to the stories we're telling. It wasn't a stretch for us to take certain creative liberties with this being a reimagined world, because we weren't interested in being a history lesson or a documentary. We wanted to explore that intersection of history and fantasy, and we wanted to see how we can marry those things in really interesting ways.
Yes, the article indicates that there was quite a lot of consulting going on, which would imply that the show sought to know at least some of its history, but it certainly wasn't making an honest representation, even, as Chris Van Dusen says, to the themes, to the characters, to the stories they are telling. Yet, here we have paragraphs of response citing historicity as the reason why the show deals with Daphne's action the way that it does.
I think that when we try to make sense of the complicated choices that these women are making, it's important to consider the era in which these women lived. We explore all kinds of social structures and hierarchies of power on the show. The scene is definitely representative of that.
I think it is very unfortunate that, in the one place where the show could have used just a bit more of inaccuracy, that is the part where we are suddenly going all in on the brutal realism of Regency-era London. I assume this is supposed to run on the idea that Daphne doesn't have the ability to grasp what she did was wrong, since the times had different social mores and norms surrounding marital business. I just find it absolutely ridiculous to think about it in these terms, because it is stated that the show is supposed to be a fantasy after all, but I cannot help but ask the question, whose fantasy was this? Was it yours? It certainly wasn't mine. The fact is that Bridgerton was always built on contradictions. A show specifically for modern audiences about Days Long Past, depicting Days Long Past while playing Billie Eilish and songs like How Deep Is Your Love. A fantasy that tries to also randomly be very historically accurate when it suits it. I think that is exactly the issue that Bridgerton consistently runs into. It wants to have its cake and eat it too. It simply does things whenever it is convenient for whatever the show seemingly wants to achieve. And if you believe that this would be the end of these issues, well, I will give the show points for never quite reaching the problematic levels of the first season, but it never shakes its uncomfortable habit of dropping nuance in favor of its main character of the season. Season 2 moves its focus onto the oldest Bridgerton sibling, Viscount Anthony Bridgerton. The first season saw him find love with one ballet dancer named Sienna, who ditches him because he wanted for her to join him in the high society, and she said no. This becomes the main motive that initially drives him this season. He wants to find someone who is perfectly suited for the role of Viscountess Bridgerton, yet for there to be no love involved.
I finally determined the difficulty, love itself. Moving it from all romantic relations shall make me all the better for it.
So a complete opposite of Sienna. This brings him to the marriage mart with a determination to find a woman who is picture perfect, and it is the exact determination that the show proceeds to take unbelievably far. The season then introduces two sisters named Kathani and Edwina Sharma. They have their own family lore where they must have Edwina marry someone of noble pedigree, so she and her family would be taken care of by her maternal grandparents. It's a whole thing. One of the sisters, Edwina, indeed happens to be the picture-perfect woman that Anthony wanted all along. She is sweet, she's graceful, unproblematic, if not a bit bland. The other one, however, is matched way better in character to Anthony. Kathani has high standards for people too, not unlike Anthony, and makes no effort to conceal her thoughts about Anthony, which are less than nice. They have the supposed hate dynamic between the two of them, which slowly develops into passion, and wouldn't you know it, we have a good old love triangle on our hands. To be fair, a love triangle in this scenario was a path of least resistance, I guess. It's not really an excuse, but more so an explanation. With the character setup that we have for Anthony, there was bound to be some sort of a storyline of him trying to find someone perfect on paper, but getting in the crosshairs of the so-called love. But as it happens with Bridgerton, love often has at least one element of toxicity in there that is glazed over as to not break the supposed fantasy. Because what happens next is that we see things develop, and Anthony and Kate are shown to be fully cognizant of their feelings towards one another. Yet Anthony proceeds to then propose to Edwina, and it gets to such a point that Anthony is literally barely able to contain himself every time he sees Kate, yet he then proceeds to take her to the altar, and only then does the other shoe drop and Edwina realizes that something is off. It is perhaps the most utterly ridiculous, melodramatic sequence of events that the show manages to muster, even by this show's standards. Then we see a period where this kerfuffle leaves Bridgertons in a lower standing and they try to navigate the social fallout, and then everyone, including Edwina, slowly warms up to the idea of Anthony and Kate together. And then they live happily ever after. Anthony continues to salivate and yearn for Kate, and they have 20 kids. The end. I don't fucking know. Now, we could talk about the fact that the sequence of events is a huge disservice towards the character of Edwina and renders her a complete idiot, but at this point, that would be a low-hanging fruit, I suppose? Or would it be? She does remain a stain in the grand love story of Anthony, because this isn't really a love triangle. Well, at least not a conventional one. Edwina, more than anything, is really just there because society demands it, and also because Kate is using her as a bit of a pawn to get money for her sister and mother. She does get her side of shit for it from Edwina, where Edwina rips her a new one for all the shenanigans that she did, and rightfully so. So do you know who doesn't get ripped a new one because he is already a massive asshole walking? Anthony. The season goes through a whole batch of flashback scenes explaining why he is so hardened. His father died when he was young and he had to take on duties to take care of the family. Obviously that is a lot to bear. I would argue that Kathani too had a lot to undertake. It is why they make a nice match. They understand each other in ways others would not. But where is Anthony's shit for the way he behaved in this whole situation, and why is it not shoveled right at the step of his door? Where's Kathani's flashbacks to explain her background? The women in his family did pick up on the fact that he had feelings for the wrong sister and did try to steer him in the right direction. But the show resolves this in them just being,
Haha, we were right.
And not,
You were so fucking wrong for what you did to Edwina.
I see a bit of Simon in Anthony too. Both men exploited the naivete of Daphne and Edwina for their own selfish needs. Simon does get narratively slapped for that, while Anthony barely gets a tap on the wrist. Anthony absolutely did not have to go through all the steps of proposing and then having a whole wedding. He knew better and had the power to do at least something about it. But no, our pal waited until the absolute last moment for the shit to hit the fan. He does make a shit attempt at excusing himself, saying that he has to see the end of things as he wouldn't want to ruin Edwina. Yet Kate tells him to just do it and he falls like a lawn chair.
And see my way to ending things.
You cannot. You cannot do that.
You shan't.
You cannot break my sister's heart.
I shall see that the wedding shall take place as soon as possible.
And then he just proceeds to make an even grander scene out of all of this nonsense. Stuff just resolves itself either way because the queen says the magical words.
I think they look beautiful together.
Beautiful indeed. Do they not? Do they not? Yes.
So it is legit now, and who cares about historicity or consequences when you have the queen card to play? Then the show has the gall and the gumption to portray Kathani and Anthony as some great love story. A love story that was born out of cheating. There. I said the C word. Sure, it was wrapped around in Regency-era courtship aesthetic, but it is still cheating. I have seen glimpses of Schrodinger's historicity surrounding this too. People like to say that it is not cheating because Anthony didn't actually have feelings for Edwina and it wasn't actually love for either of them. It was just a courtship and it was transactional because it's the Regency era. Okay, so who's to say that the way that we perceive love would be the same way that Regency era people perceived it as? Edwina, and bless her little heart, is surely naive, and Anthony was honest about him not wanting an actual love match, but Anthony also basically love-bombed her in the standards of their time and honestly ours. He showed interest in her and her hobbies, bought her a goddamn horse, did a lot of other things that would suggest that there was something there. Anthony may have not felt much, but he sure projected another image to Edwina. And actions, I would argue, are much more important than what he felt inside. Hell, maybe their times didn't have a strong concept of this type of impropriety. But if that was the case in the showverse, maybe the show wouldn't have done such a huge show and dance about love out of Edwina's initial reactions to the revelation.
I cannot marry you because I cannot betray myself. You will never meet my eyes in the same manner that you met my sisters on that altar today. You will never look at me the same way.
But you know what? Stranger things have happened in real life. If we step out of the internet and try not to hold a moral high ground, there are all sorts of stories of families brushing things under the rug in their own dysfunctional ways even when cheating occurs in the family. Edwina being all amicable after suffering extreme amounts of betrayal from both Cathani and Anthony, and the main couple having their happily ever after without any sizable consequences could be even realistic. Cheaters in real life rarely get what they deserve, but at least have something interesting to say about it other than just brushing it all under the rug. I would imagine that there could have been an avenue to explore with Edwina of what it would mean to live in a society where she couldn't be outward with her resentment towards Anthony because gossip and chatter can actually ruin people. What it would mean to still have a role to play in polite society while also having something like that happen to her. But Edwina is simply fodder to serve as Anthony, Cathani, and the plot. She isn't meant to have nuance, except that which is relevant for the drama and to characterize the main characters. At the end of the day, let me just sprinkle some reader response criticism at you. Whose fantasy is it? Is it your fantasy? It is certainly not mine. A love triangle is already shaky of a concept as is, since it inherently implies some sort of emotional or physical impropriety. Season 2 takes no steps in rectifying the problematic undertones, instead choosing to exaggerate them. And I am speaking as someone who does find enjoyment in Kate and Anthony as a coupling. They seem very well suited for each other. There is definite chemistry, and the actors absolutely carry the season. Even with the problematic undertones, they are still nice to watch, I guess, if you don't think about it. But a mark of good character writing is when the text directly engages in characters' flaws, not when it overlooks them and when it services the narrative and what it wants to tell. It is when characters are forced to face their own flaws and face the music once the chips fall, and have full and proper consequences for what they have done. The second season is a far cry from that. It actually romanticizes all the times Anthony and Cathani engage in supposed romantic moments, even if they run in the context of the engagement between the sister and him. And once again, if you believe this would be the end of these issues, well... Season 3 moves its focus to Penelope Featherington, because it is clearly not Colin's season, that's for sure, who is this wallflower-type character that is not considered to have much potential to carry a match in the marriage mart. Her love story involves friends falling in love trope with Colin Bridgerton, but her season is not entirely about that, since Penelope is also Lady Whistledown, the gossip column that often frames the Bridgerton narrative. Since it is her season, it makes sense for the show to use the secret as a source of drama, and it does. But because Penelope becomes the protagonist of a fantasy romance season, she is furnished with a similar set of glistening plot armor that Daphne and Anthony were. In season 1, I would say I did have a lot of sympathy for her, considering she was being bullied and overlooked. Her having a secret gossip rag makes sense. It's her way of having power in a situation where no one allowed her to have any. She carved out a life for herself in an otherwise awful situation, and under normal circumstances this would be applauded. She's an underdog after all, right? A bit of an anti-hero, if you may. But Penelope did a lot of things that she didn't need to do, just like Anthony, especially through Lady Whistledown. Trust me, I can sympathize with a person who has been bullied and overlooked by people and is jaded, and it is more than valid to feel strongly about that type of experience. It is not valid, however, to go on and perpetuate that abuse on a massive scale. But that is not a quarrel that I have with the writing of Penelope. I do allow my characters to be flawed and complicated, as long as they are recognized as that, and say it with me, folks, Face the consequences. If you tilt your head and squint a bit, you may realize that Lady Whistledown is really a storyline that is bound to be all about consequences. The whole ordeal was born as a way to hide herself while exposing others, so her character was bound to face what she had done at some point. And the first 2 seasons had some bits of very nice writing when it comes to Pen. A thing that stood out to me in the first season was how she handled the situation between Marina and Colin. The thing was that Marina was pregnant, but she wanted to snatch Colin up and trick him into thinking that the children are his. Pen, of course, doesn't want to let that fly, since second, it is wrong, but first because she has some morals and also feelings for Colin. It is a situation that undoubtedly should have been resolved at least in some way, as it would be morally right to protect Colin from deceit while being aware of it. Pen, however, chooses a very public forum for it, which is not the nicest thing to do. Marina might not have been a very likable character, she did just try to survive in the very same society that Pen tried surviving in, so she wasn't a girl's girl for airing her business out like that, but it does make sense and Penelope is shown as complex. Whistledown was a nuclear option, but Pen had tried other means and they failed. It's not some black and white situation, she did the best she could, with her hands steered a bit by her own predispositions too, and that is totally okay. I like that. Season 2 continues that tradition. Eloise Bridgerton is assumed to be Whistledown, and this paints a huge target on her back. And what does Pen do? Instead of giving up Whistledown and turning herself in, she decides to publicly taint Eloise's reputation. She goes ahead and still tries to save her own gossiping ass, while publicly throwing Elle under the bus, which is certainly not some altruistic choice. And then we have some of the writings by Pen in between. Penelope, for whatever the fuck reason, decides to take active shots directly at the Queen, which places her on the radar of the Queen in the first place. And I mean, I guess monarchy can go to hell, but did she have to absolutely do that? Then she proceeds to directly influence Daphne season 2 by airing out that Daphne was failing to attract suitors. The truth is that however overlooked Pen was by society, there is not even an ounce of noble cause in what she does with Whistledown. The whole idea of it is pretty shambolic. Penelope chooses to report on gossip that she overhears, but the show, for instance, is never cognizant enough to pick up on the fact that this reporting can actively hurt people exactly like Penelope. Gossip is already a deeply unpleasant thing, yet she chooses to report on it. But isn't the true problem with gossip is that it is being created by someone in the first place? So she basically chooses to report on chatter directed at others, quite literally perpetuating the harm that is being done by others? Does she not become a conduit for whatever gossip others muster up? What if that gossip is wrong, or made up by someone to hurt someone else? Does she have a 2-factor authentication process on that or something? It is truly a power to behold, because whatever Pen reports on can become true in the minds of high society. Penelope herself outlines just what could happen if Whistledown was to report on a scandal back in season 2. Selfish as she is, she only thought of this when it concerned her own family.
Did Mama send you there? Oh, what a scandal. If Whistledown writes the full story, it's not some insult about our citrus dresses. It could ruin our family. It could ruin you. It could ruin Mama. We could be run out of town.
So Pen does all of this, knowing full well the reckoning her little gossip can bring. So it is only all the more baffling when all of this setup simply results in her standing in front of everyone and the Queen,
saying, "Ooh, I'm sorry. I just wrote about y'all because y'all lives were so interesting."
and the Queen saying,
"Okay, all good, just don't be too bad about it and you can continue writing."
and then everyone just goes about their days like nothing ever happened, and she gets to marry the man she loves even if she also exposed his family previously. Because the Queen said so, so it's legit? This is just yet another instance of Schrodinger's historicity, because Pen's understanding in Season 2 acknowledges the gravity that a situation like this would actually have. Season 3 is stupid and forgets all of it, because that wouldn't serve the narrative, would it? And you know, a hilarious thing happens in Season 3. In Episode 2, we see Colin help Pen to find suitors. Eloise realizes this and tells it in a raised voice. Other ladies overhear and proceed to spread it around the event they are attending, and all the eyes fall on Pen dramatically. She runs away shaken by the experience, and Colin rips Eloise a new one for what she did.
Did you tell anyone of my helping Penelope?
No, I did not mean...
Which means you did. What could Penelope possibly have done to warrant such maltreatment?
I do appreciate your concern about cruelty, but perhaps you should like to find a looking glass, other than looking at me.
This is a bit of an emotional manipulation by the show, because it portrays Pen as sympathetic and Eloise as entirely wrong. Which on the surface I guess is true, but Pen is a huge hypocrite, because Pen, quick, What do you think you have been doing to other people all this time through your gossip rag? Pen proceeds to self-report through Whistledown, and it is framed as this tortured moment for Pen punishing herself. But honestly, spare me the fucking theatrics. She can dish it, but she suddenly cannot take it. And then we reach the pinnacle of the storyline in season 4. It shows Pen now fully out in the open as Whistledown, owning the name. People suddenly report gossip to her, and she is a bit of a celeb. She also now has the ear of the queen, but suddenly, she does not want it anymore. Oh no. Episode 5 sees her report gossip on a man having a mistress. The mistress then comes to her and asks her to write something nice about her so she could have some semblance of a good reputation. Because suddenly the show again remembers that Pen does have consequences on people. And in the span of this episode, Pen proceeds to tell the queen she will give it up for good. It takes this episode for her to learn that her bullshit has consequences. Not the past 3 years she has messed with people, no, this episode. And of course she now does that. She has a husband, she has the money, her family troubles are now over and solved, and she has some ideas for a novel or two. So when it is convenient for her, she begins to think of setting it down. A storyline that should have seen the resolution be all about consequences sees not that many of them. The outcome that Pen gets is not realistic, nor substantive enough to be satisfying or logical resolution. The end of it falls flat, simply because of the severe lack of proper reckoning. And once more, if you believe that this would be the end of these issues, well, actually, it kind of is. I am happy to report that season 4 doesn't have a meaningful conflict with lack of consequences. Or rather, not in the way that would make me feel overly conflicted. The one problematic part was Benedict suggesting Sophie becoming his mistress, but he got a good ripping from multiple characters, which was good. But season 4 does have an issue that is perhaps even bigger. It kind of goes against what it tries to say. All seasons have this, we will get to this, but this season has it in a more blatant way. So let's talk about the one thing that actually brought this video together. The Pinnacle. Let's reach our pinnacle, shall we? Back in season 3, we are properly introduced to Francesca Bridgerton, who is now making her debut in the season, and is kinda sorta looking for a match. Her mother Violet is there to guide her through the process, and they have many conversations about love. Her mother has a very specific idea of it, that it has to be all butterflies and loud and breathtaking and whatnot. All the cliche things you would associate with the romance genre's rendition of love. Francesca was set up to represent a different pace from that. She is this quiet young woman who is reserved and in general just a sweet person who has her own little interest and enjoys the quiet the most. She tells her mother that she doesn't believe that everyone gets the same love as her siblings do.
What you and Father and Daphne and Anthony will have is enviable. It is also rare. And I am not certain I need to feel butterflies of unexpected harmony per your metaphor.
And then she proceeds to meet someone who matches her freak, if you may. And that someone is Lord Kilmartin, John Sterling. He is just like her, he is quiet, reserved, but he sure as hell is very romantic. Violet suddenly chooses to be violent and is hesitant to buy into their romance, and even somewhat blocks them from marrying. She asserts to Fran that love is something that takes one's breath away and such, something that is dramatic.
You know, when I first met your father, I could barely speak my own name. I was so taken by him. I stumbled over words most familiar. What I was going to say is that for the longest time, I thought that is what love must be like for everyone. Surprising, forceful, quick.
But she finally allows them to marry, so they do. I have said this before and I will say it again, I love this direction for Bridgerton. Other characters are so different from Fran, and Fran represents a true breath of fresh air. She is so effortlessly charming and cool. I liked her romance with John the most, a very unproblematic coupling and something to relate to if you are more low-key. And then comes the last episode of the season, where she meets John's cousin, Michaela, and then she gets flustered, just like her mother said she might when meeting someone supposedly special.
I am Francesca Bridgerton. Kilmartin. Kilmartin is my name now.
And this particular choice did piss me off, because the show seemingly had a nice idea going and then proceeded to validate Violet Bridgerton and invalidate Fran's perception of love, because you also cannot forget that this was paired with Violet also meeting someone that made her stumble. Lord Anderson makes her react in that exact way.
It is a pleasure to formally meet you.
Violet Bridgerton. Lady Bridgerton, the Dowager, formally.
I'm quite enjoying my time here already.
And then we see the courtship between them. So there is clearly something that the show tried to say here. The funny thing about this is that season 4 didn't capitalize on this the way that I thought it would. Part 1 wasn't giving me much confidence in this. The first part of the season shows Fran act cagey about the time she spent living with John and Michaela, and then it also introduces the Pinnacle storyline. Now the Pinnacle storyline focuses on the fact that Fran fails to reach orgasm with John. This is also intertwined, for whatever reason, with Fran's desire to have John's children but being unable to conceive. So you can see that so far. It's not a very great look for Fran and John's love. The showrunner for seasons 3 and 4 of Bridgerton, Jez Brownell, has said something that I found to be quite interesting after part 1 of season 4 came.
Bridgerton showrunner says Francesca's Pinnacle issues are not related to her sexual identity. We are more organically wanting to explore different kinds of intimacy from different characters, Brownell explained. The Francesca story specifically I'm really excited about because I think on the show obviously people are always having magical simultaneous orgasms, and that fantasy is really fun, but also it doesn't represent accurately most women's experience.
I am going to foreshadow the rest of the video and say that it is quite hilarious that she almost has it, like a step away from seeing the issue. Let's continue.
I hope it's very clear from our storytelling that we're not trying to indicate that just because she can't have an orgasm, that it means that there is something wrong with her relationship with John, she continued. They just have a different kind of slow-growing passion. Her situation is really common, and I think it's great to represent all different types of love and different types of intimacy on screen.
And you know what? I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think it would be a toxic and honestly awful conclusion to draw, that somehow some difficulties in the bedroom should be used as a measure whether someone actually loves someone else. That is absolutely true that it shouldn't point to her not loving him. That applies under normal circumstances at least. And I will say that I expected part 2 of season 4 to go in a way more disgusting direction. I thought that part 2 will see Fran engage in some action with Michaela after he dies, and that she would be the one to help her reach her pinnacle. I am happy to report that the show navigates part 2 and John's death in a way more graceful fashion. The element that I didn't expect but appreciated very much is that the weird tension between Fran and Michaela is not just some deeper romantic feelings, but rather friction between their characters. That I was very pleasantly surprised by. But does this actually help to solve this issue? The thing about the storyline is that it almost had me. It almost made me think that I was completely wrong in my initial assessment, but it still kept bothering me. Here is the showrunner saying something that is correct, yet it still feels entirely wrong within the show. And here is exactly why. Bridgerton has its own very specific way to present the concept of love. So far we have seen 4 main couples, and there is one element that has been a constant signifier of the intensity of their feelings. That is physical attraction and sexual expression. We are not prudes around this channel. It is very safe to say that people are naturally attracted to the steamier scenes, to the tension between 2 people shown on display. And while the show may say that love comes in all shapes and forms, it also says that sexual tension also comes in different ways all the same. I think it's the reason why a lot of flaws are overlooked. People indulge in Bridgerton as a fantasy they live through vicariously. Ever since season 1, main couples have shown to engage in all sorts of yearning and fawning over one another. The usual resolution to the bottled up tension was the couple having sex. It is part of the fantasy that the show presents to you, and you get to see the couple lust after one another. Never in the show's history does it devote so much time in showing any form of difficulty around sex itself. I would argue that the show goes a great deal to glamorize what it shows. It also portrays things through the female gaze, which makes sense, nice to have. But I suppose it is time to now reveal my own cards that I have been playing throughout the video. There is a reason as to why we went through all of the seasons. Even if, for instance, Daphne's season has already been heavily dragged, it is because the show sacrifices so much realism and nuance, as is in all of these previous couples, just so they could portray their love in a glamorous way and grant them this happily ever after. It warps its own writing to sustain the exact fantasy. It is also why historicity is also completely whack. The show picks up what it wants and discards what it doesn't, precisely because this is a fantasy for these specific couples. But it is, as we have discovered at the end of the day, a selective fantasy. The showrunner herself acknowledged that couples having magical orgasms is indeed a fantasy. So why should a fantasy stop exactly at the storyline of Fran? Why is her character and love story with John so different that it should stop exactly there, and now we are zeroing in on the brutal realism of marital life and orgasms? Why is she the one to suddenly have problems with her Pinnacle, a problem that the show never really touched on. At best, it is an example of the writers not understanding what they are communicating while still being well-intentioned. At worst, there is a certain bias at work here, because it does expose how the show views Fran and John's love. Even if they claim that they love each other, it makes me think that the show views their love story as more disposable than others, that somehow they are less important to the fantasy of the show, because why else riddle it with these issues? It doesn't feel like a natural extension of the themes the show has, but rather like a,
we want to include some modern progressive topic that would be counterintuitive to the fantasy we construct. Which love story is low stakes enough to have that?
There have been attempts to explain that this issue was supposed to be in theme to Fran's character, but honestly, that is weak. Quiet people can be freaks in the sheets. It is not unheard of. I think it is important to remember that this is a hell of the show's own making. Maybe this is suddenly another case of the show becoming realistic for this brief stretch of time, but the show also deliberately makes the characters land on the conclusion that Fran wasn't getting pregnant because she didn't reach her Pinnacle. Then the show deliberately makes the choice for her to go asking around about the Pinnacle, and both her mother and Pen choosing to describe it in connection and physical terms. Fran doesn't even bring up the fact that she thinks that the lack of Pinnacle is causing her to not have a child for anyone to dispel that. So you cannot fault anyone for taking a reading of the situation as Fran having attraction issues to John. But the ultimate bad look comes from the fact that Fran's future storyline is confirmed to be queer. The showrunner has said that she viewed Fran's story in the book as a good grounds for a queer storyline, and you know what? Maybe she's right. I haven't read the book, so I cannot contest this statement, but in the show we are now facing the reality of John being dead, and he died even before Fran could have resolved her Pinnacle issues with him. So he died without making her orgasm. The only love interest in the show, by the way, to experience this. Yes, it sounds ridiculous to say it this way, but the show's telegraphing of love did rely heavily on sexual chemistry for almost all of its run. The show didn't have to tie the Pinnacle to pregnancy, but it did. So we now end up in this weird pickle where Fran cannot reach the Pinnacle because otherwise she would get pregnant, right? According to Fran at least. And we cannot have her pregnant because then it would potentially defeat the infertility storyline that the show specifically tries to build in this way. The show just complicated this part for God knows what reason. I would have understood completely if they wanted to go with an approach where these issues with the Pinnacle came up precisely due to the stress and pressure Fran feels by not being able to conceive, and they would have conveyed that. That would have made sense and wouldn't have diminished their love story. And do not get me wrong, this storyline can mesh with the general trends of the show. You want for it to reflect the character of Fran? What the hell, why not? Fran is shown to be quite withheld, so it would naturally make sense for them to have some mishaps in how to approach each other. You could have the storyline be about her discovering herself and guiding John in how to satisfy her. There could be nothing more romantic and sexy than proper communication with one another and exploring each other together. Have it be a further bonding and sensual experience for the couple. Also give some growth to Fran to learn to speak up for herself, as John was really open to listening to her already. Make it wholesome and pure instead of raunchy and lusty. It would have fit so perfectly into the fantasy. That would have been a better representation for the contemporary audience rather than leaving the Pinnacle question completely unresolved. It is not that this storyline exists that is the issue. It is that the show deliberately chooses the most unromantic approach to it. Out of all of the options on how to handle it, it is this way that it goes down. Meanwhile, it did not have to be this way. I would like to say that it is all about the spin, and the show deliberately, say it with me folks, chose not to spin it in a romantic way. So when Michaela eventually helps Fran to reach her Pinnacle, presumably because she now isn't stressed about getting pregnant and therefore has the mental clarity for it, what associations do you think the show and the audience will have with John? They may show Francesca telling the audience that she loved him and will spoon-feed us information to explain all of this away. You know, maybe she was bisexual, but she, I don't know, somehow hadn't explored herself. Okay. But that will never be a strong argued case by the formula that the show itself set up. It makes John feel not as valid in comparison, but merely a stepping stone in the grander scale of Francesca's self-discovery journey. It simply doesn't sit right with me that in this fantasy show, they gave these marital issues to the one character who they knew would end up dying young, who was the only love interest who was gentle and wasn't some outwardly expressive rake, and would be followed by a queer romance. It does not matter what Fran's sexuality ends up being, but the second love angle that a book had would no longer work as intended, and it ultimately just serves to further validate the absurd notion that Violet has, that love has to be this bigger-than-life thing. It is baffling how the show has arguably the only love story that did not have some major problematic or toxic element, and they decided to handle it in this way. The weird part of this is that Violet, who I think by the show's standards was more poised to have at least some amount of issues by the virtue of trying to find love after her one big love has passed away, was shown to be having a very well-flowing sexual relationship with Lord Anderson. If anything, I think Violet may be having second thoughts during the intercourse, which by the show's standards is basically the ultimate display of intimacy and connection between lovers, would have been a more probable exploration of some Pinnacle issues. But it does come as a bit ridiculous that basically everyone, including Violet, fucks without issues, except Fran. I honestly could not give less of a damn about whether John helped her reach the Pinnacle or not if only it was internally and externally consistent. Like, let's not launch a whole weirdly gaslighty press run about how people are wrong in interpreting something that is right there in the open. And if you believe that this would be the end of these issues, well, I will admit that with Eloise it is slightly personal. I am not a woman, I am not in the Regency era, but I can certainly identify to a degree with the way she works and the traits that she has. Ever since season 1, the show features perhaps the most progressive character in terms of views, that is Eloise Bridgerton. And I think that she as a character severely lacks context and is done a bit of a disservice by the show. Fight me about it. She's rather outspoken about how exactly she feels about concepts such as marriage, high society, and being forced to perform activities thrust upon her and that are considered to be feminine. She hates all of it. At least that is what the show presents us. She openly shows disdain towards having to dress up pretty and talk the right way to impress some man just because the society tells her to. And she shows this disdain up to such a point that we see her openly flirt not with men, but with the idea of becoming a spinster. She can also be very brash and inconsiderate in the way that she presents her views. She is quick to judge others who engage in society's order of things and is blind to the fact that they too have their own opinions and feelings. This is, after all, a romance show, so of course the other shoe would inevitably have to drop with Eloise, and she is bound to end up in a romance of her own. The showrunner has said that her trope would end up being a marriage of convenience. It is self-explanatory, but basically she is going to marry for anything other than love, and then love will creep up on her unexpectedly and all of that romantic shebang. And you know what? It is perfect for her. Marriage of convenience would imply that there is a benefit in it for Eloise as well, and maybe even agency. And that is all that her character was about. She was extremely opposed to a marriage that would leave her used, having to adjust herself to someone else, and without the ability to do what she wants. And has been a constant character trait for Eloise, reacting harshly to any suggestion that she would have to bow down to anyone. Season 4 sees her finally maturing and coming to see that it is also okay for other women to choose marriage. The show also shows her all the potential downfalls of spinsterhood, which also pushes her to realize that there are advantages to marriage. She starts off as way too idealistic and matures. The thing is that I always liked that Eloise was more of a rebel, but I don't like that she is now seemingly moving towards this mellowed out woman who just needs to find the right man to discover that love is not bad after all, because that would imply that she needed to change in that way in the first place. There is nothing wrong in feeling the way Eloise feels and also not needing some grand love story. She doesn't need a man either to somehow show her what love is. Let me be philosophical. Romantic love can be beautiful, but can a life be not well lived in the absence of it? It is silly to ask that question in the context of a show that is romance-based. It was always going to be her fate to fall for someone either way, and if we choose to step away from our screens, a person who doesn't want marriage and such can also change their minds, and they can also come to appreciate marriage. It's not unheard of, it happens all the time in real life, so I cannot say that this would be completely off. But I think it is equally as silly to craft her character to be so modern-day coded, yet exist in that setting. She ends up coming off as a product of the very same contradiction that the entire show rests upon, and it is not a good look. Perhaps it is just me who thinks this way, but just like Anthony, I, for instance, would like to consider the first season Eloise character to be a result of her upbringing and what happens until the show starts, and not just the beginning of the show's character arc. And while you may say that Eloise is constantly the way she is, I would like to ask, why does the show put her only in scenarios where she behaves the way that she does? Brave take, but imagine Bridgerton from her point of view. She could be way too judgmental to the people around her and also blind to the privileges granted to her by the Bridgerton name. But was she wrong in her ideas? Imagine living in a society that is ruled by patriarchal rules, yet you point out how wrong they are. And I feel like she is right to think that way, yet everyone around you is seemingly blind adhering to it. Not due to their own specific fault per se, since it was just accepted and adopted by the people born into that society. Eloise does have the issue of not seeing who the real enemy is sometimes, since she does sometimes love to put other women down, if a bit unintentionally. To add to this, people keep framing it as her not listening issue, but what about others listening to her? In my view, the show massively overlooks this aspect of the two-way street that human connections are, because I don't think that her issue is with women engaging in feminine activities. For instance, I think her issue is that women feel okay in engaging in feminine activities without questioning why they feel that way. I think it would be weird if people did begin listening to her all of a sudden, but it is incredibly unfair to somehow write her off as just whiny. It is a huge shame that she is just portrayed and framed as the annoying fly that decides to just fucking buzz into your ear as you try to sleep at 3 a.m. in the morning. I can perfectly see how she became this way. I too would become exactly like her if I grew up in an environment that tried to imprint values on me that I do not agree with. I would also become jaded and sarcastic and cold if others continuously refused to engage in the point I was trying to make, especially since it was fundamentally correct. I would imagine that type of life would become maddening. It's like a world of twisted mirrors in a way. When I see her talking constantly at people, I can't help but think that maybe, and this is just a complete fanfiction now, maybe she speaks like that exactly because she wasn't listened to before. I dislike that the show takes only one angle on this, how Eloise is required to take accountability for the way that she behaves and change and grow, but the show has forgiven way more horrible things from other characters in their family and glossed them over. We did see one storyline that explored something like this, which was with Cressida. Both of them did some growing, and that was nice. Yet in other instances, the show repeatedly puts her through scenes where she either is being standoffish or is pointed out to be wrong in her behavior. It's not like it's not valid to do that to an extent, but to do it to this character in particular is crazy work. I think it would have been way more fruitful to explore why she became the way she did and under what circumstances, and how her family and society was involved in it, rather than just assigning these unfavorable character traits to her like something she needs to outgrow because she's a teenager. Teenagers can be this way, but it would be dismissive to minimize someone just being a teenager, because teenagers are also people too, and they don't always begin acting certain ways without any explanation and due to hormones. Eloise just lacks so much context that could greatly help to see her and meet her halfway, yet the show doesn't show it. I could only hope that her season explores some of this additional context, but I doubt it. She already grew in the direction that they needed. Let's not kid ourselves about her presence in the first place. The show very clearly wants to score some progressive points, and then the show does all in its power to make Eloise lose credibility since none of her fears have really come true. From where she is standing, Daphne and Simon are fine, Anthony and Kate are fine, Colin and Pen are fine, Benefi are fine, even Pen's sisters got a happily ever after without much problems that Eloise so deeply hates. Modriches are thriving, only Cressida had some real issues, and John was taken out by a medical issue, not hatred for women. You see, that is the thing about the fantasy. The show just never fully commits to show the struggles of the time on women that Eloise hates to back her talk up, so of course she just comes off as whiny. The cards were always stacked against her by the show's world building and worldview. To even attempt to meet Eloise halfway, the show would have needed to break their fantasy, and that is just something that he cannot do. But the thing with her character in the show is that she was so fucking right to stay away from all of this nonsense in the first place, because the frank truth is that so far, these love stories have sucked. So what in the world makes Bridgerton special? Why did it become such a huge thing? I am still kind of not sure. I guess it's the vibes and the smut. No judgment there. But I can certainly tell you what does not make it special. It is not the accuracy of the historical period, it is not some deep character work, and it is certainly not its portrayal of love. I suppose that I myself am falling for the old entire trope of criticizing the romance genre, and that has ended up the case, I suppose. For the record, I am not a person who wouldn't want people to have nice things. I can just tell you this. This video would not even exist if the show had ever done at least one of the two things. 1. Address issues with certain characters head-on, or 2. Fully be a historical period drama and try to portray things as accurately as possible. But the one thing that you can never do is try and be both at the same time. This is perhaps the most annoying point about the show to have ever been made. From the showrunners to online discourse, the conversation just maneuvers to one or the other extreme as it is convenient for that moment, just like the show does. Yes, I understand that if you were to look at the Regency era and how the relationships manifested then, they were toxic, they were abusive, they were not some morally correct utopia, and the happily ever after was not just granted like that. But is the show like that? To have the happily ever after in Regency era parameters is something that the show cannot muster up. Therefore, it constantly commits to doing absolute bullshit to get there. So far in the most stories we saw, someone was getting fucked over in at least some way, and I am sorry, but that is just not romantic. So it is not a historical lesson. It is a fantasy. But if it is a fantasy, then for who? It is surely a fantasy, but it is disingenuous and sometimes even a toxic one.